In our next conversation, we're going to talk about the role of deacons. Gospel Tangents is supported by users like you. Please support us at gospeltangents.com or on Patreon. Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology, and first daily Mormon history podcast. I'm Rick Bennett. In our next conversation with Pastor Brittany Mangelson from the Community of Christ here in Salt Lake City, we're going to dive into priesthood. You know, they don't have young men to be teachers, deacons, and priests. How are their roles for the adults in the Community of Christ? We're also going to talk about the role of 70 in the Community of Christ. It's a little different than in the LDS Church, so you won't want to miss this conversation. Check it out. Well, that's interesting because the thought that comes into my mind, and I want to talk a little bit about deacons because we haven't talked about that.
Yeah.
But in the LDS Church, we give our 12, 13-year-old deacons an opportunity to collect fast offerings. It's once a month. And I know, well, and I'm curious the differences because, and I guess I should say it's different if you live in Utah when you don't live in Utah. But here in Utah County, the deacons go door to door of the people in the ward and ask for a fast offering. And I would say most deacons hate that.
Yeah.
They're not super social. It's a little different, I think, because you guys do it in the worship service. And you just kind of pass around a collection plate. So it's interesting to hear that the 5-year-olds are like, that's my job. Can you talk about those different dynamics with the youth?
Yeah. I mean, I think that kids just want to be included, right? I mean, and when you are used to going to school and having your voice heard and you're in a group of friends and you're used to participating with your friends, to me, it just makes sense that you would be included to that degree in your church community. And I don't know, I really think that if we want to empower leaders and disciples into the next generation, we need to include them. And I think it's interesting, you know, that you compare it to fast offerings, because I think that there's a difference between an obligation to do something and like this is, you know, maybe the only thing you're good for, and then really jazzing up this experience of like, yeah, and you got to go, you know, take the plates around. And I don't really know why the kids have gravitated towards that specifically. I mean, maybe they think it's cool when they see, you know, a $10 bill get put in and, you know, like they just feel some sense of ownership about that. But yeah, that particular thing is something that they have really clung on to. And I mean, there's a couple times where someone will just ask an adult, and this hasn't happened for weeks, if not months, because we recognized how important it is to the kids. Because yeah, if they see adults that, I mean, we've had kids cry that they haven't been asked to do it. So the mom, you know, parents have to take them out of the sanctuary. But yeah, I think we're so open with finances and what it takes to keep a congregation running. Like we just replaced our roof and we had multiple business meetings about it. We got multiple bids. We debated those bids. You know, do we want to go with this price or this package or this package? And the kids are present for all of those conversations. So I think it's really cool that they are part of the tangible process of the building, right? And not just like, oh, this is something that the adults take care of and we're just going to trust that it makes sense and trust that it works. But they actually see the adults giving that sacrifice of putting money into the plate. And I think that's really powerful. And I mean, one of the first Sundays that I came to Community of Christ, they were having a business meeting and the congregation was very apologetic about it. They're like, oh, sorry, this is going to be so boring. And I'm like, are you kidding me? There's like 15 pages of notes and there's like a spreadsheet and I can like look at the numbers and I can see all the things. I mean,
I thought you weren't a numbers person.
Well, I'm not, but I appreciate that I can at least look at it, right? I mean, the little Mormon in me was totally geeking out because all of that stuff is, you know, behind a wall in the LDS Church, but being able to see, okay, they spent this much money on stamps. Like, that's fascinating to me, right? Like, this is how much their water bill is each month. Like, I'm glad that I'm not over those things, but I appreciate that it's transparent enough. And again, like, kids are sitting in those business meetings, so they're a part of the community in very, very practical, hands-on ways, which I think is pretty cool.
This is just part of your Sunday worship service?
So business meetings usually happen after church, but I mean, people stick around. You know, we sometimes have snacks or whatever, and people want to have a voice. You know, we debate the budget. So
a linger longer?
Yes. We've actually joked about that a little bit. Yeah. Yeah.
So, linger longers for those, because I do have some non-Mormons and they're probably like, what is that? I should have you explain it. What is a linger longer?
Well, in my experience, they were typically with singles wards, right? So they would have, you know, treats or snacks or whatever, and you would linger longer to socialize. So if you're looking for your mate, you just, you know, make sure you went to the linger longer, because that's when... when, you know, the gloves came off and people were getting their flirt on, and hopefully I went to a few. I did not meet my spouse at a linger longer though, but
yeah, me neither. But I will say our ward has started, well, it's easier when you're the last church of the day because the building's empty, but we've had a couple, I don't think they actually called them a linger longer, but they kind of were.
Yeah.
And of course, in a family ward, we're not getting our flirt on, but but it's a nice way to socialize.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
It's cool.
Yeah, well, we in Salt Lake absolutely linger longer. We are supposed to end at noon, and usually I'm locking up the building around 1:30 or 2.
Oh, okay.
So we are a chatty people. I actually think a nickname for the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints used to be Chatterday Saints. This would have been, you know, back in the day. But I have heard that be thrown around. I'm like, great, we fit in. We are Community of Christ. We're a chatty group.
I've heard that too. Let's jump into the role of a deacon. We kind of glossed over that one. What does a deacon do in Community of Christ?
Yeah, so I know that I did say that I think that the role of teacher is like, quote unquote, the most important. I mean, they're all equally important. I just really think that peacemaking and reconciliation is needed in the world today. But the ministry of the deacon is also super important. The ministry of the deacon in Community of Christ, they are over hospitality. So making sure that the building is in functioning condition.
Activities committee?
The space. I mean, kind of, yeah. Like, yeah, how do we make the physical space work, right? So they also work with bishops. So they help with finances. They help with budgets. They help kind of the... task-oriented, you know, things that work with a congregation. We do have a deacon in our congregation, and
deacon.
Yes, one, yeah. And she is actually our lifelong member currently, that is currently active. And so she knows the building like the back of her hand. I mean, she's the person to go to if there's an issue, and that really fits with her job as deacon. So she's the, you know, caretaker of the congregation, really. So preparing the space, making sure that we have resources that, you know, we freely give to people. So being mindful about that. How welcoming is our space? Are there, you know, physical obstacles? How are we doing with accessibility? Those kinds of things kind of fall under the duty of a deacon. So it's very different from just, you know, an 11, 12-year-old boy that's collecting fast offerings. Not to downplay that, because that's also important. And in Community of Christ, we don't have fast offerings in the same way, but we do oblation once a month on Fast Sunday or on Communion Sunday.
Oh, you do have a fast Sunday. Yeah,
well, we don't fast. It would be Communion Sunday. So that's been kind of one of those things where I'm like, oh, this does have similar roots. You know, we do communion once a month on Fast Sunday. Again,
is it
that
the
would
first?
Be, yep, exactly. Okay. Yeah. So that's the Fast Sunday, right? So when the LDS Church is fasting, Community of Christ is doing communion, you know, officiating communion within our worship services, and then our loose offering. So if I were just to throw a $20 bill in the plate, that goes to our oblation fund, which would be abolish poverty and end needless suffering. So if somebody needs help with groceries, if somebody needs help with rent, it's the fast offerings, right? It's used in the same way that the LDS Church would use fast offerings. It's to take care of the people in a very temporal way. So,
and the bishop let's see, because the bishop doesn't attend every week, right? But they're kind of in
Correct.
charge of those offerings.
Well, yeah. So on a world church level, that would go to the presiding bishopric. So on a mission, so there's a congregation, and then there's the mission center, which is a lot of congregations that,
Like a stake.
yeah. And then there's, world church level. So world church has an oblation fund, and then congregations have an oblation fund. So you can see on our budget, that we have X amount of dollars set aside for oblation. And if we need more, we can go to the mission center level and get approval for more funding. And then if, I'm assuming if there's some sort of chain of command to get more. Again, I'm not a bishop, so I don't exactly know how it all works. But yeah, we like to take care of our people. Actually, one of the first experiences that I had with Community of Christ, I was, being taken out to dinner and lunch by ministers who were answering my questions. And it got to the point where I was like, they're like buying me food, right? I should be, offering to pay for my meal. And I was told Community of Christ doesn't build a lot of temples, but we feed people. And I think that principle, it really shows where the priorities are for Community of Christ. We are not a wealthy church by any stretch of the imagination, but I think we do a really good job to take care of people with the funding that we do have. So that's kind of a guiding principle for us of taking care of people.
Okay. So just to summarize, deacons are in charge of the building, kind of an activities committee, except for you only have one in your congregation.
Correct.
I know in the Doctrine and Covenants it says your deacon's quorum should be 12, and then teacher's quorum is up to 24, which even in the LDS Church, I don't think I've ever seen 24 teachers in a ward.
Yeah.
But 12, 24, 48 priests, 96 elders. I have been in a ward where they had to split the elders' quorum because it was so big. And then I guess above that, they don't really have limits. But, okay, so deacons are, I just mentioned that. Teachers, from an LDS point of view, you said they're peacemakers. So they don't necessarily teach on Sunday. They're going among the ward, building peace. I think Deb Luce told me they do a lot of counseling with families. Yeah. Is that true?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. And you don't have any teachers right now in your congregation.
Correct.
But you're working on it, I guess. Maybe, sort of. And then priests, let's talk about that. Because I know that priests administer the sacrament and not only bless, but they pass the sacrament as well. Mm-hmm. Is that right?
Yeah.
And then what are some of the other obligations or duties of a priest? I guess I should go to the Doctrine and Covenants, but we don't pay attention to that, do we? You guys do,
Scriptures, I think. What? Yeah, so priests, and I've said this publicly before, but priest is my favorite priesthood office. It's Jesus's friend. So modeling ministry of Jesus after just friendship and relationship building with families, with individuals. And I think that it's kind of the glue that holds a congregation together. If relationships are not strong, then the congregation's not strong. Because again, in Community of Christ, we don't think your salvation is tied up in church attendance. So you have to actually want to go to church, right? And so if you're not feeling connected to the community, you're probably not going to want to go to church. So the ministry of the priest, making sure that people are taken care of on an individual level, on a family level, it's kind of the frontline ministry of recognizing needs, of being in people's homes, and just really being a friend. So it
overlaps with teacher quite a bit, it sounds like.
Yeah, well, and honestly,
I mean, it does in the Doctrine and Covenants too.
Yeah, and I would say all of the offices in Community of Christ, they're all expressions of the ministry of Jesus. So if you have the ministry of Jesus, found in the New Testament, the Sermon on the Mount, those kinds of things, if you take the attributes that Jesus models for us, they're just kind of funneled into different priesthood offices. And so one is not necessarily more important than the other. And when you have all of them working together, then you have a really strong community. Like when you were saying the numbers in the LDS Church, how many deacons, teachers, elders to have, I just was like, wow, how awesome would that be to have a Community of Christ congregation where that many people were focused on the ministry of Jesus in like their lanes? Like it would be awesome.
Well, no ward has 12 deacons, 24 teachers, 96 elders. Although I did have, it was a regular family ward, and it was before we'd abolished the high priest, but they actually split the elders quorum because we had like 110 or something elders. And then after they split the ward, that became the ward boundary as well.
Yeah. That's funny. Yeah, and I really liked the ministry of a priest. I really enjoyed being a priest because I felt like with the title elder, there's cultural baggage that comes with that, right? So like Elder Brittany Mangelson. I mean, Brittany gives me a way of being a woman, right? Typically, but like Elder Mangelson, right? If you just hear Elder Mangelson, I mean, that gives you a very like specific idea of who this person is and what they believe and who they are. In Community of Christ, like we wouldn't use that phraseology, but here in Utah, the waters get muddied, right? And I have been called Elder Mangelson, and I'm like, oh, but like, so there's a lot of cultural baggage, I would say, that comes with that title. And so
I think LDS wouldn't call that baggage. We'd be proud to be called a Bennett. Bennett, I was a missionary.
Well, yeah. So in my ministry, with former LDS people though, like that's kind of like I don't want to say trigger in like a way, but like it carries baggage. And, I don't want to be seen as a missionary that's like trying to convert all the people. And so as a priest, it was like, no, I can't even confirm you because confirmation is the responsibility of an elder, right? And so it just felt like you can't even assume that I have a hidden agenda because I can't even make you a member of Community of Christ. So it just felt very safe, and it felt a little more approachable. Not that the ministry of an elder isn't approachable, but there's no cultural baggage with the office of priest. Like it just feels very safe. And I'm happy to be an elder. It's fine. But I was like, oh, am I going to be seen as like Elder Mangelson? Like that just kind of freaked me out a little bit.
Well, and it's funny. And if this is too personal, we can cut it out. But because I attended your son's baptism. And so your husband, Josh, is a priest and you're an elder. And I do remember thinking, oh, he kind of got demoted because I'm sure he was an elder in a LDS church. But he did the baptism. And I think you were in the circle, if I remember right, but you didn't actually confirm your son. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah. I think our dear family friend Joanne Fisher did, who's kind of his church grandma.
Okay.
Yeah.
Was she an evangelist? I can't remember.
She's a 70, actually.
Oh, okay. And so kind of a general authority. Yeah. Or is that too much baggage?
No, I mean, and again, like it's like similar words are used, but the cultural understanding of them is very different. So in Community of Christ, we would say general officer, and a 70 would not be a general officer. That would be like World Church Leadership Council. So the president of 70 would be a quote unquote general authority, or the apostles, things like that. But just your run of the mill 70 is just a 70.
See, because I know you're a lot younger than me. And so I don't know if you remember when... So my dad was, you have elder 70, high priest, and that's a stake 70, not a general authority 70.
Okay.
Yeah, so you don't remember that.
I don't.
And so I just want to make sure, because I remember, it seems like it was around 1980 or so, where they got rid of stake 70s. And they basically said, go start attending with either the high priests or the elders. And I think it was more of depending on your age. My dad got put in with the high priest and then actually became a high priest. And so I just want to make sure I understand, because we do have, I think I should know this answer better, but under President Kimball, they had a bunch of assistants to the 12. So originally, if a new stake president needed to be called, an apostle had to do it. But the church was getting so big that they had these assistants. And eventually these assistants became so unwieldy. It was around 78 to 82. I don't remember exactly the year. The President Kimball reorganized these assistants to the 12 as 70s. And so then they became the first quorum of 70, which are considered general authorities. I think the second as well. And then they have the 3rd through 8th or whatever quorums of 70, which are responsible for different areas of the world. So I know that was a long explanation, but I want to understand how your 70s compare with either our first and second, which would be general authorities, and then 3rd through 8th, which would be area authority, 70s. This woman who confirmed your son, is she like a 3rd quorum of 70?
No, that's so interesting. And again, it's one of those things. So my husband speaks Spanish, and he often compares this dialogue of like a Spanish speaker and a Portuguese speaker trying to speak the same, trying to speak to each other.
Right.
There's some overlap. There's some cultural understanding. You might recognize a word here or there, but sometimes it's like, So in this moment, I'm like processing the things that you've said, and I'm trying to like community of Christ ease it, right?
Right.
To translate it. So it's interesting. So the office of 70 would be called by an apostle and the president of 70. And it typically, it kind of sounds like it's a little bit more like the first...
The stake 70s.
A little bit, kind of. So my friend Joanne, so she lives in Boise, and she was called as a 70 in our mission center. So she was ordained a 70 in our mission center conference. So a lot of congregations come together, have a conference. We collectively, she was ordained a 70 before I showed up, but her call was collectively discussed and affirmed, and then she was ordained by... like at the conference, right? So affirmed by the conference, discussed at the conference, and then ordained to 70. So if Joanne, who lives in Boise, were to move to Orlando, Florida, she would still be a 70, and that office would carry with her. So she's not just like assigned to one geographical area. And she would not be, like a 70 is not in the leading quorums of the church, AKA having, these big international meetings. We call it World Church Leadership Council. So it's the presiding bishopric, the apostles, first presidency, high priest, quorum leader. The senior president of 70 sits on that council. And I think that would be the closest to like quote unquote general authorities or general officers. And then, the 70 are kind of that mid-level. They're assigned to a field or an area, but if they move, it's not like their priesthood just gets vanished, or it's not like the church goes into crisis because they've lost a 70. Like it's not like they're...
Would they could just get transferred from... I'm in charge of the Boise area to I'm in charge of the Orlando area now?
Well, so I'm glad you said that, because they're not really in charge of anything.
Yeah, I shouldn't have said it that way, but...
So, I mean, they're there to support congregations. So I guess talking about a 70, like it's important to say what they even do. So they're known as the forerunners of Christ's peace. So they are really the invitational ones. So they're the ones that are planting churches. They're the ones that are kind of more parallel to the missionary of the church. They're the missionary branch of the church. So they're the ones, welcoming new people in. They're the ones answering questions. They're the ones that are starting little house churches and little groups. And really, I mean, the phrase that we use would be the forerunners of Christ's peace. High priests are seen as kind of the strategic ones that are trying to build bridges, trying to reimagine, revision what the future of the church looks like. They also have more of an administrator role. So a lot of times our mission center presidents would be high priests. So they're the administrator over multiple congregations. And then the 70 are kind of the missionaries. So if a 70 or if a high priest or an elder or anyone moved, their role is not necessarily tied to a geographical location, but again, it's kind of the flavor of how they live out the ministry of Jesus. So yeah, you could function as a high priest in Salt Lake and then move to Buffalo, New York, and you would still be a high priest, and it would just contextually look different. And depending on, the area and what they need, maybe that part of your ministry would be more highlighted, or maybe it wouldn't be. I mean, like Carla moving here, she did not function as a bishop in Utah. The bishop for our area actually was Denise White. And so she's the bishop of our field. She's the one that really helps with the budget and overseeing that. So Carla was a bishop, but she kind of took her bishop role off and then put the pastor role on. So again, it's like the same words, but Carla did not function as a bishop here in the same way that she functioned as a bishop in Europe, if that makes sense. So she was the bishop over Europe, whereas she was not the bishop over Utah. She didn't function in the same way, even though she had the same priesthood office. So it's confusing.
Yeah, because I thought she was a bishop here.
She had that role. I mean, she was ordained as a bishop. But as far as like the function of her assignment and what she was doing, she wasn't called to Utah to be bishop of Utah. So that's why like sometimes the phraseology got a little confusing for people. Because she was functioning as a missionary and as a bishop, or as a pastor, sorry.
Yeah. Wasn't she in charge of the oblations, collecting the oblations and that sort of a thing as well?
So not any more than say I am. So
I thought she was. Okay.
No, yeah. So again, she had the title of bishop, but she wasn't necessarily. And I mean, she would be able to speak to this much better than
I'll have
I
to
was.
get her.
Yeah, but it definitely is two. They're two different roles, and so one kind of took front center stage more than the other. Whereas in Europe, it's my understanding she was never a pastor; she was the bishop. So she was working with mission centers, working on their budgets. But she was not necessarily helping other congregations with their budgets while she lived in Utah like she was in Europe.
Okay, that's interesting. Because just to confuse even more, I just talked with Josh Gailey, who's an evangelist for the Church of Jesus Christ. Some people call them the Bickertonites, based in Monongahela, Pennsylvania. And I asked him, well, my friend Deb Luce is an evangelist in the Community of Christ. Do you give patriarchal blessings? And he said, no. And so even though they're both evangelists, the functions in the Bickertonite Church of an evangelist, or more like a 70.
Interesting.
That they do missionary work. So he was just out here. They had their first baptism in Utah that I attended. And oh, by the way, just for fun, Bickertonites have to baptize in an open body of water. They can't do a baptismal font.
Yeah.
And so he talked about grabbing chainsaws and cutting ice to baptize somebody outside. And I mean, honestly, the baptism I attended was in the Jordan River. It was 32 degrees. It was freezing cold. I can't imagine. He wasn't there, but there were other 70s that were there that were in charge of the missionary work. And so going back to my dad being a stake 70,
yeah,
because the 70s, the stake 70s were in charge of missionary work. And so now we have a moored mission leader, but it's very functionally different than the way my dad served. And so it's interesting to see how the same name can use these offices so differently. And so that's kind of why I wanted to ask.
Yeah.
So to summarize, just to make sure I understand, this and I wish I could remember her name. The woman who confirmed your son. Mm-hmm. Did you say she's kind of like a stake 70 as opposed to a general authority 70?
I mean, that is probably the closest way that I would describe it. I don't know if it's a complete,
Accurate.
Overlap, but yeah, in that same avenue.
Okay. And so as far as, the similarities between our churches, you've got a first presidency, which there's some differences, but I'm going to ignore those for now. You've got apostles. Do you have quorums of 70 like the LDS Church?
Yes. And
So
each quorum has a president. Yeah.
And so they would be considered general officers or AKA general authorities? 70s?
Yes.
And
I
then-
would say that is a decently accurate comparison. Yes.
Okay. I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Brittany Mangelson, the pastor of the Salt Lake branch of the Community of Christ. In our next conversation, we're going to talk about what it's hard for Community of Christ members to understand about LDS members.
I would say that the concept of worthiness is probably one of the biggest. Just this idea that like a bishop, a leader of your church could deem you unworthy. They're like, what does that even mean? Like it's not even in their vernacular at all.
Thanks for listening, and I hope you to continue to enjoy Gospel Tangents. Consider becoming a Patreon or go to gospeltangents.com/shop, and you can get a cool tie, a hat, or even a nice mug. You can also get a sweatshirt. So check it out at gospeltangents.com/shop.